What's up, guys? I'm finally back with another video for you guys. I'm actually going to be talking about what's hopefully a pretty helpful subject today. I'm going to be talking about how to warm up. Okay, because if you're going into the gym and you're not doing any type of warm up and you're just getting right into it, okay, you're really going to increase that potential risk of injury, and that's how you end up getting in pain over time. So the last thing you want to do is get in pain and always be in pain. So that's why it's so important to have a warm up implemented. So if you're not doing anything, this is a good starting point. These are just guidelines. This is how I like to typically warm up for myself and for my clients. So if you're not doing anything at all, this is a good place to start, okay? So just gonna kind of walk you through that, okay? So let's just kind of take you through the 6 steps that I have as far as a warm-up, okay? If you kind of notice, 3 of the 6 steps are optional, and I'll tell you why when we get there. So it's really just 3 important steps if you're really pressed on time. But if you have time, I'd recommend going through all 6, okay? So when it comes to kind of starting off your warm-up, okay, you want to start off, I like to kind of start off with foam rolling, okay? And most of us kind of know what a foam roll is and why it's used, or maybe not, okay? I like to use a foam roller because it kind of temporarily gets me out of pain. And if I kind of use it on certain tissues, it kind of helps to just temporarily open up those tissues, and it just makes me feel good, okay? But that's the only reason you should be using it, okay? Because if you're using it thinking that you're going to just, if you're on it for a long time, thinking you're going to mobilize more and more and more, and you're going to gain more mobility from that, or if you're thinking that a foam roller is going to help kind of break up scar tissue, that's completely false, okay? So you just got to use it for just those quick temporary changes in tissue, and that's going to occur right away. So that occurs within the first 30 seconds of using it. So I like to put a cap on the foam roller. I don't like to use it longer than 2 or 3 minutes. For whatever body parts that I'm kind of rolling out. So if you're on there for like 15, 20 minutes at a time, it's kind of useless at that point. So just being really efficient with your time, just be on there quick, use it for what you need to use it for, and then that's it, okay? And that's kind of why it's optional, because if you're not in pain or nothing feels super tight, or if you just don't have access to a foam roller, we can kind of mark that one out that you don't really need it. But if you have the time and you have a foam roller, I'd recommend using one. So that's the first step, okay? As far as the second step, this is also an optional step. It's static stretching, okay? The reason it's optional is because I personally believe that static stretching is a little overrated. I don't think many people are as tight as they actually think they are, okay? It's usually lack of mobility and lack of strength that is kind of the underlying issue, not so much flexibility, okay? So, but there is certain cases where there is certain areas that are tight that you do want to stretch out. But if you're pretty much good to go from a mobility standpoint, honestly, static stretching you could probably bypass that. And to be completely honest, if you're overdoing static stretching, it could have some potential negative outcomes as far as like strength related goals or hypertrophy related goals too. So just keep that in mind. Same thing, it's kind of optional. I personally think it's a little overrated, but I would put static stretching second in certain areas, and I'll kind of go over an example of certain areas that you could potentially stretch out later on. So that's number 2, would be static stretching, also optional. Okay, and then you're gonna transition to step 3, which would be activation. Okay, so activation would just be essentially just kind of warming up muscles that are going to be used later on, and these are usually going to be posterior based muscles. So anything on the back side of our body, whether it be our shoulder blades, our back, our glutes, and our hamstrings, those are the muscles that you're going to want to activate depending on what it is that you're working on that day. So like I said, again, I will go over an example later, but there's certain muscles you want to activate from a lower body standpoint and also from an upper body standpoint. That would be number 3, would be activation, activating those muscles, kind of turning them on, getting blood in those muscles, and kind of getting your core temperature up. So number 3 would be activation. And then I like to follow that up with mobility, okay? Mobility is a little different than static stretching if you don't already know, okay? Mobility would be taking our joints through certain ranges of motion in movement, okay? So for example, like a squat, okay? Getting lower in a squat, if we can only get so low in a squat, over time we want to try to eventually get lower in a squat. That's mobility. That's different than like flexibility, where we're just kind of passively kind of trying to touch our toes or something. That's passive stretching of like muscle tissue, where here mobility is active stretching of joints, okay? So it's allowing our joints to get in deeper ranges of motion. That's going to be more important from a strength training standpoint, because when it comes to working out, okay, that's what we're doing. We're putting our joints through ranges of motion. So going back to that squat, if we're kind of limited in a squat and we want to eventually get lower in a squat, we need some mobility work to get lower into a squat, not so much flexibility. So there's a couple really good mobility drills that I like to do as well that I'll kind of go over later, but that would be number 4, would be doing your mobility, okay? Step 5, okay, would be movement prep at a light load. So this would be essentially kind of practicing whatever big movement we're going to do for that day at a lighter load. Kind of practicing that movement, grooving that movement, as well as additionally kind of increasing our core temperature and kind of doing some additional activation, okay? So I'll kind of, like I said, go over that later, but that would be, never mind, would be movement prep. Practicing the movement you're actually going to do at a lighter load for more reps, okay? That's number 5. And then number 6, this is also optional, but it's also very beneficial if you have the time for it. It's a dynamic warm-up, okay? But I just know that especially if most of you are general population, you're not an athlete, and you don't have the time for it, that could usually take some time. But it's a great way to just kind of get everything integrated in a dynamic fashion. So that would be optional too, like I said, because it's not so much necessary. If, like I said, you're a general population or you just don't have the time, that usually could take like 10 to 15 minutes. So, but that's really important as well if you have the time for it, as a dynamic warm-up following all of this other stuff, okay? So just kind of quickly going over here, you're going to start with a foam rolling, transitioning to the static stretch, which is also optional, activation, mobility, movement prep at a light load, and then your dynamic-based part of the warm-up if you have the time for it, okay? So now that we kind of got that down, okay, let's kind of transition to some quick examples of what this would look like, okay? So, for example, if I'm going to hit my lower body, okay, I would start off with just foam rolling. So some areas that I like to foam roll to start off with would be like my T-spine. That's always a given. I love foam rolling the T-spine, which is like the middle of your back, okay, opening that up a little bit. I like to kind of foam roll my calves and my glutes, because those are tissues that tend to get kind of tight and stiff, and I like the way it feels on those certain areas. It kind of helps to loosen them up temporarily, and it just kind of makes me feel good. So those would just be some general areas that I like to foam roll. That's not limited to those. So you can foam roll essentially any area, any tissue on your body. So just keep that in mind, okay? And then from there, after I'm done foaming, if I wanted to static stretch, okay, if there was any issues or any muscles that were giving me some issues from like a tightness standpoint, I would stretch out. Some common ones would be like hamstrings, your calves. Calves tend to get really tight, as well as hip flexors. Okay, those are some big issue or some big muscle groups that you'd want to potentially maybe stretch out if you are actually tight. If you're not tight in any of those areas, you can probably skip that altogether. Okay, and then from here we transition to some activation. Okay, just some examples of some activation-based exercises I like to do. With almost all my clients, we almost always do some sort of variation of a glute bridge, whether it be like a single leg glute bridge, a bridge walkout, a bridge with like a abduction, a bunch of different bridges, okay? Getting the glutes involved and the hamstrings, those are money, okay? So glute bridges and something maybe like hamstring curls with the stability bar or something like that, those are my go-tos as far as like activation. Like I said, getting the backside warmed up and activated, okay? And then from there, we're going to transition to some mobility, so some mobility-based drills. It usually involves the hips, almost all the time, mobilizing the hips. In certain occasions, even the ankles if you got some tight ankles. So some good go-to mobility drills I like to do are hip cards or hip-controlled articular rotations. If you don't know what those are, check those out. Those are awesome. The world's greatest stretch, although it's called a stretch, it's actually more of a mobility-based routine. World's greatest stretch, I love that for the hips. And just some ankle dorsiflexion drills as well to kind of open up the ankles, okay? Those are some of my go-to mobility drills for the lower body, okay? And then from there, we would transition to a movement prep. So depending on if our big lift is like a squat or a deadlift, okay? I like to do a light, either like a goblet squat with a really light load, or if I'm doing like a deadlift, it's either going to be some type of like a kettlebell deadlift or like a banded good morning to really get my hamstrings and glutes involved. And just like I said, practicing that movement that I'm going to do later on within my session. And like I said, I like to go heavier, higher reps with this. So somewhere between like 15 to 20 reps for like 1 or 2 sets. But like I said, a light load. It shouldn't be super fatiguing, okay? And then if I had the time, okay, I would do some type of dynamic warm-up. And if it's a lower body, I'd probably even add a couple of jumps and hops into working those muscles of the lower body, getting them a little more explosive and prepped and primed for my big compound lifts later on, okay? So that's the lower body, okay? When it comes to the upper body, if you can't read this, I apologize, okay? As far as foam rolling, it's still going to be the T-spine, and then usually the lats. The lats tend to get pretty tight, so I like to open up that tissue down in there. As far as static stretching, if I'm going to stretch anything at all, it's probably either going to be the pecs or the lats. Those areas of muscles tend to get a little bit tighter if there is some tightness. But like I said, I usually just kind of avoid this altogether. I don't really get super tight in those areas, but if you do, you probably want to emphasize those. As far as activation, same thing. It's posterior. It's usually some type of of scap, shoulder blade, and mid-back base type of activation. So really big on isometric Ys, Ts, and Ws. If you don't know what those are, look those up. We'll hold those positions. Some band pull-aparts, those are awesome. And even maybe some like cable rows or something like that. Like I said, just to get that backside activated and going, and hopefully potentially getting out of pain. Okay. Number 4 would be mobility. So with the mobility, it's still based pretty much on the shoulders. Those are what typically kind of get stiffened up and tight over time. So you want to make sure that your shoulder joints stay mobilized and stay out of pain. So I like to do handcuffs. If you don't know what those are, check those out. Those are awesome. Shoulder controlled articular rotations. Those are great. Those are a little more complex to understand, but those are awesome. Like a band or PVC pass-through. If you don't know what those are, check those out. Those are some of my go-tos as far as a mobility standpoint for the shoulders. Okay. Once that's done, okay, I'll get into my movement prep. It's usually going to be some sort of like pressing or overhead press, or even if it's back, you can still kind of do this as well. So I would do a light, maybe like a dumbbell bench press, or a light dumbbell, maybe overhead press. Or if you're advanced and really, really strong, even like push-ups would be a great alternative. But if you're more of like a beginner and push-ups are already really hard, we'd probably avoid those altogether. But those are just some quick examples. You can even do like some lat pull downs on like a pulling day or something like that, real light, okay? And then if you had a dynamic, same thing, you do your dynamic. And if I'm going to emphasize my upper body, I might do some maybe additional medicine ball drills, just to kind of activate and kind of prime my upper body muscles. So maybe like a med ball chest pass or a med ball overhead throw to get my upper body muscles really going explosively and getting them primed. Okay. And in the case where maybe you're doing like a full body day, okay, you would just combine all of this together and maybe just take like one of each. So instead of doing like 2 or 3 different type of mobility drills or 2 or 3 activation drills, maybe you're just picking one from each to kind of warm up your entire body. Okay. So, like I said, hopefully this helps. If it's a little hard to read, I'll also post like a picture so you guys can kind of see a better close-up view of this. Like I said, these are general guidelines. If you're not doing anything, this is a great place to start. Granted, everybody's individualized warm-up is going to be different, but like I said, these are guidelines. It's somewhere to start, and like I said, this is kind of how I like to approach my warm-ups for my clients. So hopefully this helps, and let me know what you think, guys. I'll try to make another video soon. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Have a good one.